Hello and welcome. Welcome to Alta Live. I am so excited to see everyone here today for a conversation with historian Bill Deverell. Let's kind of kick it right off. Today we're going to discuss Finding Frances. It's the second in Alta's new serials, an online series in which we offer tales of heart-thumping action, genuine emotion, and shrewd writing, presented in 5 parts over the course of 5 weeks. The first in Alta Serials was Marianne Wiggins, the kind of early part of her new book, Properties of Thirst. The second part is called the second serial we offered is Finding Frances by William Francis Deverell, who joins us today. Bill is the director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, and a professor of history at USC, among many, many other accolades. And now about Finding Frances. This extraordinary true life twisty story follows the disappearance of Bill's great uncle Francis. It begins in snowy upstate New York before moving to Europe and eventually Los Angeles. As Bill searches for his missing great uncle, he discovers more than he bargained for. We're going to start at the beginning, and I will warn the audience before we give away the ending for anyone who wants to read Finding Frances first. Frances is ultimately found. I won't tell you how that happens or what Bill found out without warning you, but we're going to get right into that. Before we begin, some brief Alta housekeeping. Alta Live is the digital interview series we do here at Alta Journal. If you are unfamiliar with Alta, we are an award-winning quarterly magazine and website focused on California and the West. You can join us and support the work we do, including events like this, our monthly California book club, for as little as $3 a month. I hope you check out our website, altaonline.com. And if you've been considering joining us as a member and subscribing, now is a really wonderful time, and I encourage you to do it. Please consider. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions for Bill. We will chat for about 30 minutes, and then Bill's got to run. So we're going to get going. Bill, it is so great to see you today. I like asking everyone to kind of chime in and let us know where they're zooming in from. Where are you today?
Right now, I'm at the Huntington Library, Beth. I'm in my office here at the Huntington, and I'm delighted to be with you. Thanks so much for the invitation. And I can see from folks that are joining us, I've got family members who've piped in today. So I'm thrilled about that. And maybe some family members from Frances's life that I don't know. So I'm thrilled about that too.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, now I've read the 5-part Finding Frances 3 times through. I've got a very good grasp on this. Francis was your father's uncle.
Correct.
Your great uncle.
Correct.
Can you tell us when you first remember hearing about your Uncle Francis, your great Uncle Francis?
Let's see. There were 3 children in that family: my grandmother, Helen, my uncle, John Francis, and his brother, Eugene. I think I probably first heard about Francis when I was a child because I was curious as to why my middle name was Francis, and my father as well. I'm William Francis Deverell Jr. And I think my father probably told me, I can remember being about 11 or 12 years old, that we were named for his uncle who came home from the First World War and disappeared.
And when you, so all you knew essentially was that you had this great uncle. Your grandma had a brother who went off to World War I. He served in France, as far as you knew.
Yep. And
disappeared. And you kind of start off Finding Frances with your father finding his uniform, his army uniform.
Yeah.
In the attic.
My dad used to talk about that quite a bit, that there was a doughboy uniform that was starched and neatly folded in the attic bedroom that my dad occupied in the family home in Rochester, in the middle of Rochester, New York. And my dad told me that as a boy, he dressed up in that uniform to play soldier, I think all by himself, up in that attic.
Sorry, spam. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I knew more about the uniform than the man who had occupied it.
Did your grandmother mind that it was talking about Uncle Francis secretive for your dad? Did he ever talk to you about that? Was it a forbidden topic? This
No, it was
once disappeared?
No, good question, Beth, but it wasn't for a couple of reasons. One, they just didn't know much of anything about what had happened to him. And also, both my dad's mom and dad died when he was young. So they died when he was a teenager, two separate events. So there wasn't a grandma and grandpa around to talk about or hide from discussions about their lost boy.
What about your dad's grandparents? Was your dad
No,
alive?
gone. My dad didn't know them. They were gone
Wow.
before then too. So he did have his sisters, and this is tied to the family members that have joined us on the call today. His sister Jean and his sister Peg, who were older sisters, and of course, in this story, they figure in one of the most interesting turns that we discovered.
So so do you know at all? I mean, and we'll kind of get to how you eventually located Francis's real story. But do you know any of the details of what he experienced in World War I? Because essentially he was born and raised in the Rochester area, got married, had a wife named Catherine, was sent off to Europe to fight in World War I, came back, and 2 months later,
Gone. Yeah.
yes.
Well, some members of the family took hold of that mystery and they layered it with folklore, which is what people can do when there's mystery or maybe even grief. So part of the story my dad grew up with was Francis never came home from the war. He died a hero in the war. He died a soldier's death. My father was always skeptical of that because he had the uniform and he dressed up in it and played in it. So he never thought that was true. And then in terms of his experiences in the First World War, I can remember as a little boy being driven by the family home in Rochester, which was in a tight-knit working class neighborhood, still is. And I knew the Catholic Church was predominantly powerful in that neighborhood. I always thought in my mind's eye that it was an ethnic enclave of Irish and Italians and other Catholics, which I think is true, but tight and closed in, felt closed in to me even when I drove by it as a little boy. Well, that world gets shattered when Francis gets drafted and sent off to London to train in Fort Dix in New Jersey, and then takes a ship, gets to London, then off to France and the battlefields of the First World War. We do know about the battles that he and his unit were in. He was in an artillery regiment or artillery unit that saw some ferocious combat towards the latter months of the war because the United States doesn't get in too late. So we know from regimental and battalion histories what kind of combat he and his buddies faced, and it was terrific.
All right, I'm gonna, just so we can kind of give everyone a visual, I've queued up a couple of photos, if that's all right with you, Bill. This is the house you were just referring to.
Yes.
And this is where Francis grew up.
This is where my father grew up.
Your father grew up.
Yeah,
with
so the
Francis's
attic there,
sister,
Beth.
your mom.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So my grandma, grandpa, my dad, and my two aunts grew up in this home, 78 Devon Road. And then that attic up there at the center of the house is where my father's bedroom was. And this is my dad as a young boy with the family dog, Cappy.
All right. And then we have Francis.
Yeah, this is just trenched warfare in the First World War. So this is the environment Francis was in. This is not a family picture, but it's you can't really beautify the battlefields of the First World War in any shape or form. This is grim, trenched combat with battlefield techniques of the 15th, 16th, 17th century and weapons of the 20th century. This is really dark and grim, and that's the world he was in for several long months.
How old was he when he went off to Europe to fight?
He's in his early 20s. He'd been married, I think got married at 19 or 20, something like that, early 20s, to, I assume, a young woman from the church and or the neighborhood. She moved in with his parents at their home on Main Street in Rochester as he went off to train and then went off to war.
All right. Now, so as far as you know,
sorry, Beth, I didn't see the picture on the right. I apologize. That is Francis on the right in the suit. That is my great uncle John Francis Daly, who I actually think bears a strong resemblance to my own son, John.
Really?
Yeah. Now I could be reading, but he looks a little bit like my boy.
This is your paternal grandmother's brother.
Correct.
All right. So, as far as you know, family lore has it that Francis's maybe died a hero in the war, but you kind of, your father seems to know that he came back from the war, stayed in the Rochester area, reconnected with his wife for about 2 months, and then disappeared. In 2016, your dad asks something of you. You are now
Yeah.
established historian William Francis Deverell of the University of Southern California, and your father comes to you and says what?
Yeah. So this is William Francis Sr. and myself, and this is towards the latter days of his life. My father's ailing there, but he was a really vibrant personality and a vibrant intellect. And as he aged, he got more and more interested in family history, which is not uncommon. And he got really good at it. He worked with several genealogists who helped excavate the family history in Ireland, where we're from on this line of the family. And at one point in 2016, he called me into his study at his home in Colorado Springs, where my mom and dad lived. And I knew a little bit about Francis, but my dad said, I think I've gone as far as I can go. Can you, with your training and some of your contacts and your library friends and all, can you help me find him? I'd like to find him. And of course, A, I'm not going to say no to my dad for that kind of family request. And B, I did know some things that perhaps help.
Well, yeah. Can you and your library friends go and find him? All right. So if you have not read Finding Francis and you don't want to know, if you want to wait and enjoy all 5 parts, you can come. This is being recorded. You can come back to this later. We're going to talk about what happened to Francis starting now. Okay, Bill, you've got this directive from Bill Sr. What do you do? Where do you start to find out what happened? Where Francis went?
Yeah, my dad was an exceedingly well-organized man. He was a Air Force officer and a physician, and he had files, and he had collected family histories and genealogies in files. He had family trees. He had notes, and so we went into some of those files together, and we could piece together the first 25 years of Francis's life through, conventional historical sources, through some light touch family memories of him. And then once he gets into the First World War, the tracking system of the United States War Department is pretty sophisticated. So where did he sign up? What unit was he with? What happened to that unit? When did they come home? Was he honorably discharged, et cetera? So you can pack in some of that information in that early part of the life. And then, knowing that he dropped out of sight, you begin to start poking around with various genealogical tools, which are really incredibly sophisticated these days. Ancestry.com is the best known, but there are others, and a whole series of databases that we can tap into, looking for a guy who unfortunately has a fairly common Irish American name, John Francis Daly. There's a lot of John Francis Dalys out there. But you can dial it in. I knew when he was born, I knew where he was born. So it becomes this kind of sifting process. And lo and behold, in the research, going on to these online sources, et cetera, his life and some of the dates and data that describe and explain his life began almost in a peripheral vision way to speak to or look kind of similar to the life and data of a man not named John Francis Daly, but whose experiences in life seem to be suggesting that they might be the same guy. And so that peripheral awareness of him led us to family members that we didn't know we had. And I'm delighted to see Kathleen Hoffers join us here in the Zoom room. My father's second cousin, turns out. And lo and behold, as we were understanding in Francis's first half of his life, essentially, there were others out there who knew about his second half of his life, but didn't know anything about the first. And so one way or another, we found ourselves to one another and began to share Francis Part 1, and they shared Francis Part 2. And we realized that that accommodation of this guy who wasn't named Francis and Francis, they were the same man.
Tell us about Francis Part 2.
So I had originally thought, and my father and I had a conversation actually about this. The Irish American roots go fairly deep, and the awareness of Irish American history and culture in our family. So I had originally suspected maybe Francis had gone to Ireland. He could have disappeared into the Irish countryside as some kind of laborer, and he probably still had contact with family members over there, one or two generations removed from his parents. But he didn't. In fact, what he did is he came all the way to the far west coast of the United States. This is a man who, prior to the First World War experience, had probably never been very many miles away from home. So even going to Fort Dix, New Jersey to train was a big journey for him. Then he gets on a vessel and crosses the Atlantic Ocean, and then he's in the war in northwestern France. So it's mind-blowing to me that he comes home 2 months later, he's gone. And the next identifying feature of him, not as John Francis Daly, but under his new nom de plume, which is Harry Wheeler. Harry Wheeler shows up in all likelihood, Mexicali, California, marrying a young Mexican-American young woman, and starting a new life, not in Mexico, but in Southern California.
You suspect he got married in Mexico, however, to kind of sneak around some formal paperwork?
Well, it certainly is suggestive that that's true because he was still married. So he is a bigamist. So he's still married to Catherine back home in his parents' home, or who shortly moved out. She gets the marriage, his first wife, gets the marriage annulled or dissolved in the 1920s on account of, as the court finding is, his quote unquote disappearance. But by then he's already married to a woman who went by the name of Lee Syens, whose father was a fairly prominent dealer and manufacturer of beer and other liquor on the east side of LA. So, and John Francis Daly, now Harry Wheeler, stays married to her until he dies, and they have 3 children.
Those children being your dad's cousins.
Correct. Those children are my dad's cousin, and then Kathleen, who's joined us on the call today, is the daughter of one of those children, so second cousin to my father and some kind of cousin to me, and she has been extraordinarily helpful in helping me line up Francis Part 1 with Francis Part 2. And so now we've rounded out the man, but we haven't explained the mystery.
Well, and that mystery is why he disappeared. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, we can make all kinds of guesses, and we can surmise this or that. Somewhere in between wanting to escape the shackles of the church, particularly the shackles of a marriage, perhaps, that wouldn't allow him to divorce. 19 teens Catholicism is not going to allow him to divorce Catherine. So perhaps that's part of it. One could suggest that there was some PTSD involved in heavy combat experience of an artilleryman, where they're firing off those large cannons with no ear protection, no nothing. That could be part of it. Is it wanderlust? Is it, I've heard about Southern California and I want to go out there without my wife? I don't know. I don't think he talked about it much. I mean, as Kathleen said to me about her grandfather, Harry Wheeler, we didn't know the backstory. We didn't know chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, because I don't think he talked about it.
Well, yeah, he can't say, by the way, my name's really Francis.
Correct.
I mean, once you marry Lee and have your 3 kids, and he is committed to being Harry Wheeler. Now, a couple of things I want to touch on. I'm being sensitive to your time. Bill's very busy.
It's okay. We can carry over a bit, Beth. It's okay.
Okay.
I got slightly released from my obligation.
Oh, good. Okay. So Harry Wheeler, it turns out this name may not have been plucked from thin air.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there are folks on the call from the Wheeler side of the family that may know more about this. Because I think there's more to be known, of course, always. There was a Harry Wheeler, like John Francis Daly, there's a lot of Harry Wheelers in American history and life. There was a Harry Wheeler in his ward, his neighborhood in Rochester, New York, a little boy who was younger than John Francis Daly? Was that a family friend? Did he know this little boy? That little boy, oftentimes you see this in the past where the name of someone who died is taken on by an imposter. Harry Wheeler of the neighborhood did not die young. He lived a long life. Did John Francis Daly hit on that because he remembered playing with this boy? We don't know, of course.
Or,
and I checked
or like his life. I mean,
it's just, we don't know. But I checked there's a lot of Harry Wheelers in First World War Army service for the United States. Was there a crossover with a Harry Wheeler who was with an artillery regiment in France? No, I couldn't find that because you could imagine that he was fighting alongside a Harry Wheeler who was killed, and he takes on that name.
Whole plot line in Mad Men. Yes,
exactly. So I don't see that. Exactly. It is a Mad Men story, but I don't see that. I do see, thanks to the Wheeler side of the family, his Social Security card. He got in the 1930s, which says very prominently Harry Wheeler.
Wow. All right. So then you are talking, first of all, it sounds like you have such a fun, historically kind of minded down to talk about this family. At least now, the present generations, the living generations of your family seem, both from the Daly / Deverell side and this new Wheeler side that you didn't know was your family, are seem to be willing to like, hey, let's talk about this, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, it's been wonderful because I've created lines of lineage that I didn't know existed, and there is a streak of educators on both sides of the Harry Wheeler family. So that's great.
Now, your aunts, your dad's sisters, one of them seems to remember a train trip to California in which her mother, your grandma Helen, had a conversation.
Yeah, this is so.
With a guy.
My cousin Jack is on the call, which is great. His mom was my Aunt Margaret, or Peg, and her sister was Aunt Jean, who's the mom of all my other cousins. My Aunt Jean, both those aunts are gone now, as is my dad, of course. My Aunt Jean, when I asked her about Francis, she said, well, we had heard he'd been killed in the war. But I said, no, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. And I think by then I'd known that there was a California connection. And my Aunt Jean said, oh, she said, when Peg and I were little girls, before your father was born, our mother took us on a long train ride across the United States to California to meet someone. It had to have been him.
Right. So he, for whatever reason, kept in touch with his sister Helen. Assuming that that's what it was.
Yeah, somehow
she was cool enough with it to go visit.
Yeah, exactly, Beth. And what makes the story even all the more poignant and remarkable is that a picture of my two aunts as little girls is in the possession of the Wheeler side of the family. So they were given a picture of those two little girls who came out with their mom to see Harry and his children.
His nieces.
Yeah.
Your dad didn't get to go?
My dad wasn't born yet.
Oh,
so my dad had no idea about this part of the story, which has fallen into place more or less since my father died.
So your father never got the final answer, as at least the answer that we get to have in 2022?
Yeah, I think there's more to know here for sure. My father knew that Harry Wheeler and John Francis were the same man.
Okay.
So my father knew that he'd been found, which was great because he knew that well before he died in June of 2020. But the ensuing 2.5 years or so, we've learned more, thanks largely to the Wheeler side of the family.
It's extraordinary. It's just, I have questions, kind of historian and overall questions now. But if you haven't already, I really encourage you to read all 5 parts of Finding Francis. There's also a number of coincidences that pop in. Harry worked for Huntington, and you are physically at the Huntington.
Yeah, that one just really blew my mind because he disappeared. and he ends up working for the Pacific Electric Railroad, which is the great trolley system that served the county of Los Angeles back in the day, which had been owned as part of a monopoly transit package by Henry Huntington, who built, along with his wife, the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens, where I spend half my professional life. And so that coincidence, I couldn't believe it. Harry was a baggage and mail handler for the railroad, the transit, the trolley system. And he and Lee and their children lived, at least for a while, 7 miles due east, like on a straight line from where I live with my wife, Jenny, and our children, Helen and John.
Wild. And then lastly, Catherine, poor Catherine, who married a guy that went off to war and came back and then disappeared. Tell us what happened to Catherine.
So she has a remarkably hardscrabble life, and I have made contact with some of her family members. She got her marriage dissolved in the mid-20s, as I said. There's a little squib in the Rochester newspaper that announces it as a kind of legal decision that she can marry. So she marries a guy who's an auto mechanic, who, by the accounts of her family members, was very, very abusive to her. She and he had a son, and I'll get to that in a second. They lived as husband and wife with their little boy 4 blocks from where my father at that time was in high school in Rochester at the Aquinas Institute. So I think it's entirely plausible that my father, walking to and from school, walked past Catherine, who was his uncle's first wife.
His former aunt.
Yes. So, but the strange, circuitous twist of this is that Myron was her second husband's name. Catherine and Myron had their son, as I said, and they named him Harry.
Wild. And then Catherine dies.
Yeah, she got hit by a car.
Driven by a guy named...
Driven by a guy named Francis. Yeah. I'm not making it up.
No, I know. It's just
life is tragic.
Extraordinary. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah. And then in one way is the close of this chapter of this fascinating story for me is when my son, John, he and I puzzled out where we figured Harry was buried with help from family members, etc. And sure enough, we went 30 miles from here to a cemetery, Catholic cemetery I'd never been to. And the delightful staff members, basically they said, can you help you? And my son and I said, we're looking for somebody. And they said, somebody always is. And so they said, what's the name? And they got on their computers and they said, yeah, go out and drive this way, turn left, park, walk up to aisle 3 and grave 17 or whatnot. And there he was.
This is extraordinary. So I want to, in the last kind of few minutes that we have, I'm curious what it's like as a historian that spent so much time focusing on famous people of history, famous cities of, your focus on the West and specifically Los Angeles. This is so personal. And now you're dealing with asking family members, perhaps complicated questions, finding new family members through complicated means. What is that like for you?
Well, it's a complicated response, I think. This story in a lot of ways was also finding my father, not that we were at all estranged, we weren't, but just sort of honoring him and thinking about his uncle and my relationship to my dad. It's all very powerful in that way. It's also, as an historian, I'm quick to say everybody's got a Francis. I mean, every family has mystery. Every family has grief, of course, but every family has somebody in the family that they just don't know what the story is there. And as a professional historian, I can put together some of the fragmentary pieces. I can say he got off the boat in May of 1919 or whatever. But what he thought about, why he made the decisions he made, I'm not going to get that. So it is intensely personal, but it's also, in a way, very vernacular in that this is the story of all of us. And everybody's life has mystery and intrigue to it. Everybody's life has heartache. Everybody's life has love gained and love lost. So it's universal.
As Keith points out here in the comments, this is close to the story of his great-grandfather. So
There you go.
I'll have to ask around. I'm curious if you think that is it both the passage of time that you think allowed your dad and perhaps the current generations of your family the willingness to talk about this or to kind of ask tough questions of your own family? Is it the technology that's now available to you to be able to find each other that's prompted this, a combo?
Yeah. Good questions. I think it's all those. So Francis, even when my father and I would talk about him, it wasn't scandalous. In other words, I mean, he left his first wife and he married another woman, but we didn't know that. It was just mysterious. What happened to that guy? And then, again, following a kind of pattern that we see a lot of, as my father aged, pulling together the family tree and trying to fill in the limbs that were missing, that became very important to him. So in part, I would say, everybody dig in your family tree now, keep digging at it, because you don't have to be, my father was in his 80s when he really got into this in really deep ways. There's going to be stories for everybody. And 10 years from now, our ability to track people is going to be better and better and better. I do think, and this is thanks to a historian friend of mine, I do think Francis's generation between the First and Second World Wars is the last in the United States where you could really disappear. I mean, we found him, but he disappeared for 60 years or thereabouts, 55 years or so. So certainly after the Second World War and after cell phone technology, et cetera, very difficult to do this. Very, very difficult.
Wow. So what are you going to, I realize that there's still more to unearth about Harry/Francis. But what do you do with this? What happens to this 5-part series, Finding Francis? What are you gonna, I mean, it sounds like a movie. Write a book.
I don't know.
Is there another family mystery you've got to solve?
Well, sure. Let's find a family mystery. But part of me thinks I've kind of done it now with this, and I was so pleased to write it in this form. The folks at Alta were great. Matt Haber, who helped edit the thing, was so good about, stop this part right here, pick it up next time, etc. So that was really a privilege to work with such talented editors on this thing. So I don't know, Beth. I guess when I was finding Francis, I thought about him a lot. And now that we've found him, although there's more to know, I do find myself thinking less often about him.
Interesting. Closure.
Maybe, but as I say in the piece, next month, I've got a professional meeting in San Antonio, and I'm going to meet second cousin Kathleen, who shares my fascination for this past, who is an educator. And we may be able to brainstorm some other research avenue to see if we can flesh this story out even more. Who knows?
And you could look very similar.
Well, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, we are related.
I am so inspired to call my mom and find out about my own family mysteries. And I hope that our audience is as well. Bill, it is always a joy to read your work, to talk to you. You are my favorite historian. Thank you so much for sharing this very personal. Oh, Michael Wheeler says we absolutely do have more family mysteries. So it looks like you'll be put to work at the next family reunion. But this is so fabulous to get to learn from you. So thank you, Bill. And before everyone leaves, please do join us. Next week, we will have a love letter to Oakland's libraries with Liam O'Donoghue. He hosts East Bay yesterday. So for history buffs as well, we're going to celebrate and talk about the amazing, fabulous libraries of Oakland and their history rooms. Again, this will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later today. William Francis Deverell, thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. Thanks to everybody at Alta. Thanks for everyone joining us.